Imagine, just for a second, the sheer audacity it takes to walk into a courtroom and sue your own government.
Right. It's not something you hear about every day.
Exactly. And you're not suing them because a state employee, actually committed a murder. You are suing them because their investigators were so profoundly disorganized, so blinded by their own assumptions that they basically destroyed the physical evidence.
Yeah, they actively compromise the case.
Right. They ignored the obvious suspects. They essentially took the absolute only chance you had at finding your daughter alive or, even just finding her body, and they shredded it. So you're suing the state for stealing your chance at justice. And imagine the shockwave when you actually win.
It is, honestly, an almost incomprehensible legal feat. It completely redefines the boundaries of state responsibility because, when we usually look at the criminal justice system, we accept a certain margin of error, right?
Yeah, of course. We know people aren't perfect.
Exactly. We assume police do their best, and sometimes, well, the bad guy gets away. But what we are examining today in this deep dive is a threshold where incompetence crosses over into gross negligence. It becomes a tangible, measurable injury against a family.
And that injury is really the dark heart of our discussion today. We are traveling back to January 9th, 2003. We're looking at the small, quiet town of Guermantes, which is located just east of Paris.
The very standard, peaceful suburban area.
Very peaceful. And our subject is a 9-year-old girl named Estelle Mouzin. Now, we've spent weeks poring over a massive stack of sources for you guys. We've got legal analyses from the Club des Juristes, forensic documentaries, press archives, and just extensive historical record.
Yeah, a ton of material to get through.
And we are taking a really strict investigative journalist approach to this material today because this isn't just, a standard true crime narrative.
No, not at all. It is a 20-year saga. We're going to dissect the forensic breakdown of just a fundamentally flawed investigation. Right. And we are going to trace Eric Mouzin's unprecedented, decades-long legal war against the French state itself. Plus, we really need to look closely at the psychological mechanisms of France's most notorious serial-killing couple, trying to understand how they operated with such impunity for so long.
So let's ground ourselves in the physical reality of that day, January 9, 2003. Estelle, who was born on June 29, 1993, is 9 years old. It's winter in France.
Right, so it's getting dark early.
Exactly. It's early evening, about 6:15 p.m. The temperature is hovering right around freezing, and the sun has already set. She is walking home from school, and a passerby spots her near a local bakery. She is exactly 750 meters from her mother, Suzanne's house.
Which is really close. That is less than a half mile.
Less than a half mile. If you walk at a normal pace, that's what, a 7-minute journey?
Yeah, barely 10 minutes even for a kid.
Right. So think about a 7-minute walk you take every day. Down your street to your local coffee shop, to your car. In that tiny window of time and space, Estelle Mouzin just vanishes.
And the timeline of the immediate aftermath is so critical here for understanding the domino effect of failures that followed.
Tell us about that.
So Suzanne returns home from work. She realizes Estelle isn't there. And there is no lingering, no waiting around to see if maybe she stopped at a friend's house. The panic is immediate. By 7:30 p.m., barely an hour and 15 minutes after Estelle was last seen, Suzanne is at the local police station in Langy-sur-Marne filing a missing person report.
Wow, that is incredibly fast for a missing person report.
It is. Now, Estelle's parents, Suzanne and Eric Mouzin, they are actually in the process of divorcing at this time. Eric lives about 60 kilometers away in Le Vésinet with their older son, Arthur. So the authorities are alerted with incredible speed. They literally have that golden hour.
But they completely squander it.
Yes, they do.
The initial response from the local authorities is entirely dismissive. They just assume it's a runaway situation.
Yeah.
And, I try to put myself in the mindset of a police officer looking at a distraught mother at 7:30 at night in the freezing cold, being told a 9-year-old hasn't come home. Right.
How do you default to, oh, she probably ran away? It defies all logic regarding the behavior of a child that age in those weather conditions.
Well, to understand that, you have to look at the systemic culture of law enforcement regarding missing persons at the time. 20 years ago, the default assumption was almost always the path of least resistance.
Which is just administratively easier.
Exactly. Classifying an incident as a runaway is administratively simple. It requires very little immediate manpower. It's also psychologically comforting for the authorities.
Because it implies the kid is safe somewhere.
Yeah, it implies the child is alive, maybe acting out, and will eventually get hungry and just come home. Recognizing it immediately as an abduction requires a massive, instantaneous mobilization of resources that local precincts are rarely eager to initiate without, say, a ransom note or a witness to a physical struggle.
But the reality finally forces their hand the next day. So it's January 10th. She hasn't come home. The Mo prosecutor officially opens a judicial investigation for kidnapping and illegal confinement.
Which completely changes the jurisdiction. Right, the case is handed over to the Regional Judicial Police, the SRPJ of Versailles, under the command of Commissioner Jean-Marc Bloch. And suddenly, the strategy completely flips. They go from total apathy to a staggering, almost chaotic mobilization.
Yeah, for listeners who might be unfamiliar with the French law enforcement structure, the SRPJ, which is the Service Régional de Police Judiciaire, they handle severe, complex crimes across a wide geographic region. They are the heavy hitters.
The big guns.
Exactly. But when they take over, the response becomes an unprecedented spectacle. You have marine divers plunging into the freezing waters to drag all the local waterways. You have 170 national police officers. You have 300 gendarmes, which are essentially a military force tasked with law enforcement duties in suburban and rural areas. And most bafflingly, they bring in the CRS.
Okay, the CRS, those are the riot police, right?
Yes, they are.
The heavily armored units you see deployed during massive street protests in Paris. Why on earth are riot police searching for a missing 9-year-old?
Because the investigation shifted from a methodical search to a show of force. The state felt they needed to demonstrate to the media and to the public that it was taking this seriously. By January 14th, 5 days after she vanished, they physically locked down the entire town of Guermantes.
Wow.
They established checkpoints and systematically searched all 350 houses in the commune.
See, that approach just feels entirely counterproductive to me. It's like a hospital where the doctors, instead of, I don't know, running targeted blood tests on a crashing patient, decide to just start cutting open every organ at once to show the family they're working hard.
That's a really morbid but accurate analogy.
When you lock down a town days after an abduction, you are bringing hundreds of heavy boots, massive vehicles, and a swirling media circus into what is essentially a delicate crime scene. If someone grabbed a child off the street and put her in a car, they were gone within 3 minutes.
Right.
Tearing apart a neighbor's attic 5 days later doesn't find the child. It just tramples all the subtle forensic clues left on the street.
That is precisely the danger of the spectacle search. It exhausts your manpower on low-probability areas while completely blinding you to the actual investigative threads you need to be pulling. And when investigators are exhausted and overwhelmed by the sheer noise of the media, their judgment regarding incoming tips becomes severely compromised.
Which brings us to the first massive derailment of the case. It happens right in the middle of this chaos on January 12th. The investigators actually get a break. A man calls the answering machine at Estelle's school. He simultaneously leaves a message on her mother's home answering machine.
And what did the message say?
The voice on the tape says, "We kidnapped her, but he claims she is alive and that they are going to put her on a TGV, a high-speed train bound for Paris."
Now, you have to consider the technological context of 2003 here. Call tracing wasn't the instantaneous GPS pinging process we have on our smartphones today.
Right, it wasn't just hitting a button.
No, tracing a landline call, especially a public one, required coordinating with telecommunications hubs to map the routing of the signal. So the police mobilized this enormous dragnet. They have officers physically searching every single high-speed train running along the southern corridor from Avignon to Paris.
That is a massive undertaking.
It really is. They eventually traced the origin of the calls to a public phone booth in Avignon, which is a city hundreds of kilometers to the south.
So they hunt this guy down. On February 7th, almost a full month after Estelle vanished, they arrest him in the town of Cavaillon. They think, okay, we have our kidnapper. But it completely falls apart. Commissioner Bloch has to stand in front of the press cameras and basically admit the man is just a, quote, dangerous mythomaniac.
He had absolutely zero connection to Estelle. He was just a deeply disturbed individual who watched the media circus unfolding in Guermantes on TV and decided to insert himself into the narrative for a sense of power and attention.
That is sickening.
It is. He was eventually sentenced to 2 years in prison for the hoax, but the damage to the investigation was incalculable.
Because it cost them a month. A whole month where they were chasing ghosts on high-speed trains while the real trail in Guermantes grew ice cold. And the tragedy of that wasted month isn't just lost time. It's what was happening, or rather, what was being destroyed back at the actual scene of the crime.
This is where it gets incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, this detail from the sources is perhaps the most infuriating aspect of the entire 20-year saga. During the initial chaotic sweep of the area, investigators actually found physical evidence right behind Estelle's mother's house.
Yes, they found cigarette butts and a bag of pastries discarded near the property line. Items that did not belong to the family, left in a location that offered a direct line of sight to the house.
In a missing child case, those items are absolute gold. They hold saliva, touch DNA, fingerprints. They are the biological signature of whoever was standing there, potentially watching the house, waiting.
And what did the investigators do with them?
They threw them away. They literally destroyed the evidence without ever sending it to a lab for analysis. I mean, how does a professional judicial police unit commit an error that egregious? It feels like something out of a bad movie.
It really does, but the sources point out it wasn't malicious. It was the direct result of systemic dysfunction. The legal analyses we reviewed highlight the profound lack of method and coordination within the dispersed teams of the Versailles SRPJ.
Too many cooks in the kitchen.
Exactly. When you have overlapping jurisdictions, the local police, the regional police, the gendarmes, the riot police, and no singular ironclad chain of command enforcing strict forensic protocol, the environment just becomes chaotic. Officer A assumes Officer B photographed the scene. Officer B assumes the lab team already cleared the perimeter.
Oh, that makes sense, tragically.
Or, even worse, an investigator looks at a bag of pastries, decides it doesn't fit their personal preconceived theory of how the kidnapping happened, and literally tosses it in the trash to clean up the scene. Leads were closed before they were even opened. Suspect profiles were ignored because they didn't match the working hypothesis of the day.
And when you destroy your physical evidence, you essentially blind yourself. You're left fumbling in the dark. And that blindness is exactly what birthed a 15-year wild goose chase. Just a relentless carousel of false hopes that subjected the Mouzin family to unimaginable psychological torture.
It's hard to even fathom what the parents went through.
I really want to spend some time looking at these false leads because they illustrate a specific pathology of a stalled investigation. It wasn't just that police were looking in the wrong places, it was how they were looking. Let's look at 2008, the Royal Walk incident.
The Royal Woke is a masterclass in how unverified rumor, amplified by media pressure, can entirely hijack a desperate investigation. A journalist receives a tip from a disgruntled former employee of a Chinese restaurant called the Royal Woke, located in Brie-Comte-Robert, which is about 25 kilometers from Guermantes.
Okay.
The employee claims that during renovations a year earlier, in 2007, workers found a human skeleton beneath the floor. And supposedly, to avoid drawing the attention of authorities because they were employing undocumented workers, the owners simply poured concrete over the bones.
I mean, on paper, if you are an investigator desperate for a break, that sounds like a lead you absolutely have to follow.
I do.
But the execution was pure madness. They don't just quietly investigate. They bring in heavy machinery, they bring in jackhammers and backhoes. They literally tear the floor of this restaurant to pieces on live national television.
A complete spectacle.
And the Mouzin family is watching this happen. The parents are holding their breath with every single strike of the jackhammer, agonizing over whether their little girl is buried under a commercial kitchen.
And the forensic process of an excavation like that is grueling. They used ground-penetrating radar, which can detect anomalies in soil density beneath concrete. But radar cannot tell you what the anomaly is. So they dug. And what did they find?
Animal bones, right?
Yes, animal bones. The remains of dogs and sheep, likely discarded from an old butchery or farm that previously occupied the land long before the restaurant even existed.
It was a complete disaster. The state ended up having to pay over 300,000 euros in compensation to the restaurant owners for destroying their business over a baseless rumor.
But they didn't learn their lesson, unfortunately.
No, they really didn't. A year later, in 2009, they launch a massive international digital manhunt. Someone finds a photo on a pedocriminal website that looks remarkably like an age-progressed image of what Estelle might look like at 15.
The complexity of that lead was immense. The website was hosted on servers in the United States, but the architecture of the site was traced back to creators in Estonia.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, tracking an image across international servers on the dark web requires navigating a labyrinth of international law, Interpol requests, and agonizing bureaucratic delays. The French authorities poured immense resources into identifying the origin of this single JPEG file.
And when they finally trace it back to its source, they discover it's an old, completely unrelated photograph of another girl. It had absolutely nothing to do with Estelle.
Just another dead end.
Then, in 2011, a 60-year-old inmate in the Santé prison in Paris is formally accused by his own cellmate of the murder. So the police pull him out, interrogate him, investigate his past, and eventually have to totally clear him. It was just a cellmate trying to leverage a high-profile case for a reduced sentence.
The psychological phenomenon driving all of this isn't just desperation. It is confirmation bias operating on an institutional scale.
That makes total sense.
When a trail goes completely cold for years, investigators are starved for momentum. The human brain naturally seeks patterns to resolve ambiguity. When you apply that to a group of highly stressed investigators under immense public scrutiny, every single shadow starts to look like a suspect.
Exactly. I think about the 2012 incident in Besançon. A hotel maid finds a suitcase abandoned in a room. She opens it, and it is entirely filled with press clippings, photos, and articles about Estelle Mouzin's disappearance. It looks exactly like what you see in the movies. You know, a killer's morbid trophy case.
Right, a very cinematic clue.
The police pounce on it. They track down the person who rented the room.
And who do they find? A 20-year-old man. If you do the math, he was only 11 years old when Estelle vanished in 2003.
Right.
He wasn't a killer. He was a deeply troubled young man who had developed an obsessive, morbid fixation on a true crime story from his childhood. But because the police wanted so badly to find the killer's trophy case, they saw a suspect instead of just an internet obsessive.
Even as late as 2017, the family is still grasping at straws. They formally request the authorities to investigate Nordal Lendes, a man who had recently become infamous in France for the murder of another young girl, Maëlys.
A very high-profile case as well.
Yeah, so the investigators have to pull Lendes' military records, only to quickly clear him because in January 2003, he was stationed thousands of miles away in French Guiana doing his military service.
So he couldn't have been there.
Exactly. You see this timeline of wild, disparate theories, digging up restaurants, chasing IP addresses in Estonia, interrogating random inmates, and it begs the question, how do you miss the actual monster? Because while they were staring at dog bones and 11-year-old true crime obsessives, the real perpetrator was hiding in plain sight.
And the true tragedy is that the real perpetrator was not an unknown entity. He was a man the justice system already knew intimately.
Right.
Let's pivot our focus to June 2003, just 6 months after Estelle disappeared. We move across the border into Belgium. A 17-year-old girl is walking down the street when a man forces her into his van. But this girl fights back furiously. She manages to escape, she gets to the police, and she gives them a very good description of the van. The Belgian police move quickly and arrest the driver. His name is Michel Fourniret.
Michel Fourniret. The French press would eventually dub him the Ogre of the Ardennes. He is one of the most prolific, terrifying figures in modern European history. But what is so enraging is his backstory. As you said, he didn't appear out of nowhere. In 1984, long before Estelle was even born, Fourniret was convicted in the Paris region for a series of sexual assaults on minors.
He was sentenced to 7 years, but he only served 3. He was released in 1987 under a system that seems incomprehensibly naive by today's standards.
How so?
He was released without any police monitoring, no parole officer check-ins, no inclusion on a national sex offender registry, because such a centralized, rigorous tool just didn't exist in the same way then. He simply walked out of prison a free man.
He moves to a small village called Flowing in the Ardennes region, right near the Belgian border, and he lives an incredibly mundane, hermit-like existence. His neighbors thought he was just a quiet, slightly grumpy older guy who kept to himself. The level of his camouflage was terrifying.
He blended right in.
One of the sources noted that a neighbor actually invited Fourniret to his son's communion party. Fourniret attended, ate cake, smiled, completely undetected, completely unaware that this man had abducted and murdered a young girl just weeks prior.
But to really understand how a solitary sex offender evolved into a highly organized, prolific serial killer, we have to examine the other half of the equation. We cannot understand Michel Fourniret without introducing his wife, Monique Olivier.
Their origin story is one of the darkest things I've ever read. They didn't meet at a bar or through friends. They met through a prison pen pal advertisement in a Catholic magazine.
Yeah.
Fourniret was still in prison, serving his sentence for assaulting minors. Olivier was a woman on the outside, deeply disillusioned with her life, fresh out of a bitter divorce. She was looking for what she described as a, quote, life raft, and she knew exactly who she was writing to. She knew his crimes.
We have insight into this dynamic thanks to the exhaustive work of lawyer Gerard Chemla, who represents the families of several of their victims. Chemla studied their early prison correspondence. He discovered that their relationship wasn't built on romance. It was a calculated, transactional criminal pact forged through letters.
The details of this pact are sickening. Fourniret promised Olivier that when he was released, he would hunt down and murder the men from her past, specifically her first husband, who she felt had wronged her. He would be her personal instrument of vengeance.
And what does she have to do in return?
In exchange, she had to provide him with something. She had to supply him with virgins. Fourniret, in his letters, grotesquely referred to his preferred victims as tight slits.
It was a deeply symbiotic pathology. Chemley uses an incredibly apt analogy to explain their dynamic. He says, you need both the jerrycan and the match before everything can burst into flames.
Wow.
Fourniret was the gasoline. He had the violent intent, the dark urges. But Monique Olivier was the match. Without her, Fourniret might have reoffended, sure, but he likely would have been caught quickly as a sloppy, violent predator. With her, he became a calculated, unstoppable machine.
We have to look at how they operated in the real world to understand why she was so vital. Look at the murder of 20-year-old university student Fabienne Leroy in 1988. Fourniret didn't just grab her off a dark street. Olivier was the lure. At the time, Monique Olivier was 8 months pregnant.
That's just horrifying to think about.
They pull up alongside Fabienne in their car. Olivier leans out the window, clutching her massive belly, pretending to be violently ill, and begs Fabienne for directions to the nearest doctor.
It is the complete weaponization of human empathy. If you are a young woman walking home and a frantic, heavily pregnant woman begs you for medical help, your evolutionary defenses just drop. You don't see a threat, you see a mother in distress.
Exactly.
Fabienne gets into the car to help them navigate. Once the doors lock, the trap springs. And it's crucial to note her role inside the car. Psychiatric experts and later testimonies revealed that while Olivier played the quiet, submissive wife in public during the crimes, she was the enforcer.
She's the one holding the gun, right?
Yes. It was Olivier who held the gun on Fabienne while Fourniret bound her wrists. It was Olivier who visually inspected the victims to confirm to Fourniret that they were virgins. She wasn't a bystander. She was the architect of the environment that allowed the murders to happen.
Okay, so let's bring this back to the timeline of Estelle Mouzin. It's June 2003. Fourniret is arrested in Belgium. The Belgian police realize they have a serial predator on their hands. They start coordinating with French authorities. The French investigators look at Fourniret as a potential suspect for Estelle's disappearance back in January.
Makes sense.
He fits the profile of a child abductor perfectly, but they clear him. They completely rule him out. How does that happen?
They cleared him because of an alibi that, on paper, appeared mathematically ironclad. Investigators examined Fourniret's telecommunications records. They found a record of a phone call placed from his home landline in Sarthe-Kastine, Belgium. The call was placed to his son's phone on January 9, 2003.
And the timing.
The time of the call aligned almost perfectly with the narrow window of time when Estelle vanished in Guermantes.
It's a question of physical geography, then. Guermantes is near Paris. Sarthe-Kastine is deep in Belgium. It is roughly a 2.5-hour drive between the two locations.
Okay.
If Fourniret is sitting in his living room in Belgium making a phone call at the exact time Estelle is kidnapped, he physically cannot be the kidnapper.
Exactly. The investigators looked at the routing date of the landline, confirmed the call originated from that specific house, and concluded the laws of physics exonerated him. But their reliance on that single data point caused them to ignore a mountain of behavioral and circumstantial red flags.
The missed red flags are agonizing to read about. During interrogations, Monique Olivier casually mentions that she and Fourniret had been watching television programs about Estelle's disappearance. She tells police that when the news anchors speculated about a predator, Fourniret actually laughed at the screen.
That is classic predatory behavior.
And yet, the police dismiss it. Then you have the psychological profilers. French psychiatrists advising the investigation team looked at Fourniret's past victims and confidently stated that Estelle, at 9 years old, was too young to fit his established profile.
That is a fundamental, catastrophic failure of criminal profiling. Profiling is an investigative tool. It is not an immutable law of physics. Serial offenders evolve. Their preferences can shift based on opportunity, age, or a desire to escalate their crimes.
So it was just bad advice.
Yes. Telling investigators to ignore a known pedophile because the victim is 2 years younger than his usual target is profoundly negligent. Furthermore, the investigators failed to deeply interrogate the mechanics of the alibi itself. They interviewed Fourniret's son, who received the call. The son stated he didn't even remember receiving a phone call from his father on that day, even though it was his birthday.
Wait, I need to stop you there. If I'm an investigator in 2006 and the entire alibi rests on a phone call, and the recipient of the call says, I don't remember talking to him, how does that not trigger a massive red alert?
It absolutely should have.
And what about the
Yeah.
technology? In 2003, call forwarding existed. PBX systems existed. You could program a phone in Belgium to route a call from a different location. Did they even look into the possibility that he spoofed the origin of the call?
They didn't. They accepted the most basic interpretation of the telecom data. And their tunnel vision only worsened as the years went on. In 2006, and again during a review in 2010, Belgian authorities sent forensic evidence seized from Fourniret's home to the French investigators. When technicians analyzed Fourniret's seized computers, they found saved photographs of Estelle Mouzin.
And it wasn't just digital files. They found a physical stash of items Fourniret had meticulously kept. Among these items were a pair of white laces and a pair of black gloves. Let's remember what Estelle was wearing on the freezing night she disappeared. White laced boots and black gloves.
Just unbelievable.
You have a known serial killer of girls. You have photos of the missing girl on his hard drive. You have items matching her exact clothing in his trophy stash. And the authorities look at that phone record from Belgium and say, nope, the math doesn't work. He's cleared.
It is the ultimate danger of investigative inertia. The investigators were so wedded to the binary logic of the landline record and so paralyzed by the overwhelming volume of the massive, chaotic case file they had built that they refused to consider the obvious alternative, which is that a highly intelligent, manipulative serial killer might have engineered the alibi.
That paralysis is what leads to the most extraordinary chapter of this story. We're now jumping forward to January 9, 2018. It is the exactly 15-year anniversary of Estelle's disappearance. Eric Mouzin, Estelle's father, has spent a decade and a half watching the state dig up restaurants, chase internet trolls, and ignore the man with his daughter's photos on his computer.
His endurance is unfathomable.
It really is. But on this anniversary, he steps up to a bank of microphones and declares war. He announces he is suing the French state for faute lourde, which is gross negligence.
This is a monumental pivot. In French law, the state is generally protected by sovereignty principles. Suing the justice system for failing to solve a crime is exceptionally rare and incredibly difficult. You are essentially asking the state to indict itself for incompetence. The legal analysis provided by the Club des Juristes provides a brilliant breakdown of how Eric Mouzin's legal team, led by Didier Sebon, approached this seemingly impossible task.
They knew they couldn't walk into a courtroom and say, the French state murdered Estelle Mouzin. That is legally impossible to prove because the state didn't kidnap her.
Right.
So they utilized a very specific, sophisticated legal concept called perte de chance, which translates to loss of chance. I want to make sure we explain this clearly because it's the fulcrum of the entire lawsuit.
The best way to understand perte de chance in a civil liability context is to think about a lottery ticket.
Okay, I like this analogy.
Imagine you hold a lottery ticket for a massive drawing. Before the drawing happens, someone negligently destroys your ticket. You go to court to sue them. You cannot mathematically prove that your ticket was the winning ticket. The court won't award you the jackpot. But what you can prove is that the person's negligence destroyed your chance to participate.
They stole your opportunity to win.
Exactly. You are compensated for the loss of the opportunity itself.
That is a perfect analogy. If we apply that to the Mouzin investigation, the argument Didier Sebon is making is devastating. He isn't saying the police failing to arrest Fourniret in 2003 caused Estelle's death. Tragically, given Fourniret's history, Estelle was likely murdered very shortly after her abduction.
Sadly, yes.
What Sebon argued is that by throwing away the cigarette butts and pastries, by ignoring the white laces in the computer photos, by failing to interrogate a flimsy phone alibi, the state destroyed the chance to identify the killer early on. And infinitely more importantly, they destroyed the chance to find Estelle's body before the earth reclaimed it, before memories faded, and before the trail went completely cold.
Exactly. It's a claim for immense moral and financial prejudice resulting from systemic dysfunction. Eric Mouzin was demanding that the state formally acknowledge that their chaotic, disorganized methodology actively harmed his family. And this lawsuit wasn't just a personal crusade. It acted as a blinding spotlight on the broader systemic reality of cold cases across France.
Because Eric's fight, the media attention he garnered, and the legal precedent he was threatening to set, it forced a massive shift. It directly contributed to the creation of the Nanterre Cold Case Unit, which is a specialized national task force dedicated exclusively to unsolved serial crimes.
And if you look at the statistics that necessitated the creation of that unit, they are a damning indictment of the historical justice system. The sources highlight that in these severe kidnapping and murder cold cases, 80 to 85% of the victims are women and young girls.
That's a staggering number.
For decades, the system treated these disappearances with casual indifference. They were categorized quickly as runaways. The files were tossed into dusty courthouse basements, and the families were left to rot in the dark. Eric Mouzin refused to let Estelle be a dusty file. He used the law as a weapon to force the system to look at its own failures.
And that immense pressure finally breaks the dam. We move into 2019. The landscape has shifted. The state is on the defensive. In July, after 16 years of stagnation, the case is finally stripped from the original jurisdiction in Meaux and transferred to the specialized courts in Paris. A new investigative judge takes over.
Judge Sabine Karras.
Right, Judge Sabine Karras. And she immediately does something the previous 7 judges failed to do. She looks at the mountain of disorganized files, the false leads, the noise, and she sweeps it all off the table. In October 2019, she announces they were dropping everything else. They're focusing exclusively on the Michel Fourniret lead.
Judge Karras was exceptional because she recognized the psychological reality of the suspects. She understood the jerry can and the match dynamic we discussed earlier. She knew that Fourniret, who was now in his late 70s and suffering from early-stage cognitive decline and Alzheimer's, was deeply manipulative.
He wasn't going to talk.
No, he enjoyed playing games with investigators. He was unlikely to crack first. The weak point in the armor, the structural flaw in their pact, was Monique Olivier.
Let's set the scene for November 21st, 2019, the interrogation room. Judge Karras brings Monique Olivier in. You can almost feel the tension in the transcripts. The judge doesn't just ask questions. She systematically corners her. She lays out the inconsistencies. She points to the phone records, the photos of Estelle, the sheer impossibility of the narrative they spun for 16 years.
She just wears her down.
She grinds down the defenses. And finally, after nearly 2 decades of lies, Olivier cracks.
She retracts the alibi. It is a breathtaking moment of legal clarity. Olivier confesses to Judge Karras that the famous phone call, the call placed from their home in Belgium to Fourniret's son on January 9, 2003, the call that exonerated Fourniret for 16 years, was not made by Michel Fourniret. It was made by her.
How exactly did she do it? Did she just pick up the phone and lie to his son?
It was incredibly calculated. Fourniret instructed her to make the call specifically to establish his alibi. She picked up the landline in Belgium and dialed the son's number. When the son answered, she either stayed silent or feigned a bad connection and hung up, or briefly spoke and deflected.
Oh, so simple.
Very simple. The telecommunications data only recorded that a connection was made between the 2 lines at that specific time. The data couldn't prove who was breathing on the other end of the receiver. And while that phone was ringing in Belgium, Michel Fourniret was hundreds of kilometers away. He was in Guermantes, France.
It's devastating. A single engineered lie, bolstered by a police force too lazy to look past a spreadsheet, bought a serial killer 16 years of immunity. The immediate fallout is rapid. Within days, on November 27, 2019, Michel Fourniret is formally indicted for kidnapping resulting in death. But getting a formal confession out of him, getting him to actually speak the words, is a completely different battle.
We reach January 23, 2020, the confrontation between Judge Karras and Michel Fourniret. It is a psychological chess match. Fourniret is manipulative to the very end. He plays games. He leans into his age, constantly telling the judge his memory is failing him, pretending to be a confused old man.
Just playing the victim.
Exactly. But Judge Karras pushes him on the collapse of his alibi. And then Fourniret utters one of the most chilling, cryptic admissions imaginable. He looks to the judge and says, "I exhort you to treat me as guilty."
I exhort you to treat me as guilty. He is so arrogant, so deeply narcissistic, that he still won't give the judge the simple satisfaction of saying, "I killed her." He speaks in riddles, but he's conceding the board. He knows he's cornered. And the very next day, January 24th, Judge Karras brings Monique Olivier back in to twist the knife.
And she delivers.
Olivier confirms the horrific details. She tells the judge that Fourniret had actually scouted the Guermantes area in the days prior to the abduction. He had driven the streets, watching the children. He returned home to Belgium and told her he had spotted a beautiful little subject.
That phrase, beautiful little subject, perfectly encapsulates the sociopathic detachment with which they viewed human life. Estelle wasn't a child. She was an object to be consumed. Olivier formally confirms to the judge that her husband kidnapped and killed Estelle Mouzin.
The final domino falls a few weeks later. On March 6, 2020, after a grueling multi-day interrogation led by Judge Karras, where she relentlessly presented him with Olivier's testimonies, Michel Fourniret finally officially confesses to the murder.
But in the realm of criminal law, a confession from a documented pathological liar isn't enough to secure a conviction, especially if you don't have a body. You need physical proof tying the victim to the perpetrator. Which brings us to the crucial forensic breakthrough in August 2020.
We are now 17.5 years after Estelle vanished. Investigators traveled to a property in Ville-sur-Lomme, a commune in the Ardennes region. This house formerly belonged to Michel Fourniret's sister. It was a place he had access to in 2003. They search the property, and they seize a mattress.
And this is where modern science bridges the gap left by historical incompetence. Forensic technicians analyzed the mattress using DNA extraction techniques that were light years ahead of what was available in 2003. They find microscopic, partial traces of Estelle Mouzin's DNA embedded in the fabric.
That's huge.
It is the very first piece of irrefutable physical evidence linking the little girl directly to the killer's orbit. It anchors Monique Olivier's confession in biological reality.
And once that physical proof exists, Olivier's admissions escalate. In April 2021, Didier Seban, the lawyer who engineered the lawsuit against the state, steps before the press with a horrifying update. Monique Olivier has confessed even more. She wasn't just the voice on the phone in Belgium. She admits she actively traveled to the Ardennes. She was present in the house in Ville-sur-Lomme.
It just gets darker and darker.
She was there when Estelle was held captive. She was there when the 9-year-old was raped, and she was there when she was strangled to death. The match was in the room.
It shatters the remaining illusion that Olivier was just an accessory after the fact. She was a fully participatory accomplice in the final, brutal hours of Estelle's life.
The stage is finally set. The state has the confessions, they have the DNA, they have the narrative. They are finally preparing to put Michel Fourniret on trial for the murder of Estelle Mouzin. And then biology intervenes with a bitter, bitter irony. In May 2021, Michel Fourniret dies in a secure hospital at the age of 79.
After nearly 2 decades of fighting to get this man into a courtroom, Eric Mouzin is robbed of that final confrontation. Under French law, the death of the accused results in the immediate extinction of public action. You cannot try a dead man. The legal machinery against Fourniret simply stops. He takes his ultimate secrets, the exact details of his crimes, to the grave.
Which fundamentally alters the entire power dynamic of the case. Think about the psychological profile of Monique Olivier we discussed. For decades, her survival strategy was to play the passive, submissive, battered wife coerced by a monster. But the moment Fourniret's heart stops, the landscape shifts. By admitting her presence at the murders and by being the sole living person who knows where the bodies are buried, Olivier transitions into the dominant player.
She becomes the ultimate gatekeeper of the truth. She now holds absolute power over the justice system and agonizingly over the families of the victims. She controls the flow of information. She can dole out clues or withhold them based on her psychological whims.
And because she is the last one standing, the full weight of the law falls squarely on her shoulders. We reached November 28th, 2023. The trial opens at the Haute-Seine Assize Court. For those unfamiliar, the Assize Court in France is the only court that tries severe felonies like murder with a panel of professional judges alongside a jury of citizens.
Right.
Monique Olivier stands trial alone in the glass box. She is facing charges for complicity in 3 separate murders. Marie-Angèle Domes, Joanna Parrish, who was a British student at Field in 1990, and Estelle Mouzin.
It was a trial where the ghost of Fourniret loomed over every proceeding, but the prosecution's focus was laser-sharp on Olivier's agency. The court painstakingly dissected her role. They demonstrated she was not a bystander paralyzed by fear, but a crucial facilitator. She provided the lures, she provided the alibis, and she provided the environment for the murders.
The trial lasts for weeks. On December 19th, 2023, the verdict is handed down. The jury finds her guilty. Monique Olivier is sentenced to life imprisonment with a strict 20-year non-parole period. Given her age, she will almost certainly die in prison. In terms of securing a conviction, in terms of putting the perpetrators behind bars, the legal battle is over.
But the legal conclusion of a trial is not the same as the end of the story, and this is where the narrative reaches its most agonizing limitation.
Because as we reach the end of this deep dive, we are left with unfinished business. Following the confessions in 2020 and 2021, the authorities leaned heavily on Monique Olivier to tell them where Estelle was buried. She provided vague directions, pointing them to the dense, sprawling woods of the commune of Isancourt-et-Rumel in the Ardennes.
The state launched massive excavation operations in 2021 and 2022. They were desperate to correct their past failures. They brought in military engineering units. They used advanced ground-penetrating radar. They hired expert archaeologists. They systematically chopped down acres of ancient forest. They moved thousands of tons of earth, digging grid by grid, trench by trench.
And the result of all that effort, all that immense technology, and millions of euros is nothing.
Nothing at all.
The tragic, devastating reality is that they found absolutely nothing. The Earth refused to give up its secrets. Olivier's memory was either intentionally deceptive or genuinely eroded by time and the geography of the changing forest.
It highlights a profound limitation of the criminal justice system that we rarely discuss. The system has incredible power. It can investigate, it can issue subpoenas, it can indict, and it can incarcerate. It can deliver a piece of paper that says guilty, but it cannot force the ground to open up. When a killer dies or when a complicit survivor plays games with her memory, the legal process reaches its absolute impenetrable boundary.
I think about Eric Mouzin. His lawyer, Didier Saban, stated Eric's ultimate goal so clearly throughout this entire fight. It was never just about putting people in a concrete cell. It was about extracting his daughter from the narrative of the worst serial killer in French history.
It's about bringing her home.
Yes, bringing her home. It was about the fundamental human need to give a child a dignified funeral, a place to rest, a place where a father can go to grieve.
The legal victory against the state for loss of chance proved that the system failed him. The conviction of Monique Olivier proved who was responsible. But neither of those victories satisfied the core mission. The system caught up, but it caught up too late to secure the physical reality of the loss.
And that leaves us with a profound, unsettling reality to mull over. You, listening right now, likely consume stories of crime and justice expecting a neat resolution. We demand closure from our courts. We want the gavel to strike, the music to swell, and the story to be tied up with a bow.
But real life isn't like that.
No. In the real world, the legal battle can yield convictions, the monsters can be locked away or dead, the paperwork can be perfectly filed, and the lingering trauma remains completely unresolved. The Earth still holds its secrets. And so, after 20 years of chaotic searches, destroyed evidence, landmark lawsuits, and horrific confessions, the true mystery remains locked in the soil of the Ardennes. The lingering, echoing question remains for you to carry with you. Where is Estelle?